As revolutions occurred across the Atlantic, Latin America attempted and eventually successfully gained their independence. Four important events that shifted the Latin American mindset towards rebellion were the American Revolution, French Revolution, Haiti gaining independence, and the French invasion of Portugal and Spain that led to a rebellion with Spain.
The American Revolution showed the Latin American colonies that it was possible to break apart from a mother country. The French Revolution's slogan was liberty, equality, and fraternity, which appealed to most of the Latin American population, but not the Creole elite. The Creole elite rejected the radicals of France, the killing of their king, the rejection of the church's authority, and social leveling through the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
A slave rebellion was started by Toussaint Louverture that ended in independence for Haiti. This alarmed the Creoles, but gave slaves and former slaves hope for freedom in the rest of Latin America. The last major event entailed the French invading Portugal and Spain and the fighting of guerrilla wars in Spain. This gave Latin Americans more confidence in fighting against their Spanish controllers.
When Latin America decided to fight for independence, they did so through three main courses of action. The first was Agustin de Iturbide being sent to put down the rebelling forces of Mexico, but then he made an agreement with them that made him emperor and Mexico a republic. Central America was then split into independent nations.
The second was in northern South America when Caracas attempted to move towards independence in 1810. Simon Bolivar, a wealthy Creole military officer, emerged as a leader of the revolt against Spain and won several victories between 1817 and 1822 in Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. This led to the countries uniting into Gran Colombia, which was eventually divided, and Bolivar rejecting monarchy requests until his death in 1830.
The last was in southern South America when there was an independence movement under José de San Martín in Rio de la Plata, or Buenos Aires. It boomed economically and residents resented Spanish trade restrictions, so they opted for autonomy, or self-government. It gained independence in 1816, but many countries still didn't have complete independence. By 1825, all of Spanish South America had gained political freedom and all of the countries emerged as republics.
Brazil achieved independence like other countries in South America, but in a different way. By the end of the 18th century, they were growing in economic importance, which caused European demand for colonial product from Brazil and an increase in slave trade for labor. Although many wanted an open trading system, many workers didn't want to upset the political system for fear of slave uprisings, so independence movements were unsuccessful.
When Portugal was invaded by the French in 1807, the entire Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, where Rio de Janeiro became the capital of the Portuguese Empire. This opened Brazil to world commerce and trade. Dom João VI ruled in Brazil until 1820 when Napoleon was defeated and Portugal was free from the French.
Now that Portugal was free, Dom João VI was instructed to return to Portugal, so he left his son Pedro I in charge and asked him to declare independence if it was necessary. Independence for Brazil was declared in 1822, and Dom Pedro I became Emperor of Brazil. Brazil was now a monarchy, even though independent, under the Portuguese ruling house.
By 1830, former Spanish and Portuguese colonies were independent. They were representative governments, careers open to talent not race, freedom of trade, right to private property, and individuals became the basis of society. Some states even tried to gain religious freedom after being ruled by the Roman Catholic Spanish. Slavery was abolished by 1854. The right to vote was only given to literate men, and racism was still very much present.
The independent colonies split into regions, although hopes of unification were kept alive. Mexico, proclaimed a republic in 1823, had an unstable government until the 1860s because of financial and political issues. A union was formed within Central America, excluding Mexico's monarchy. But the resentment of the largest territory of Guatemala led to it breaking up in 1838. There was also a South American union formed between Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela, but it ended in 1830 after Bolivar's death.
Most attempts at union failed because of political interests, geography, and rivalries, so Spanish America formed into 18 separate nations. Warfare was constant between these nations and caudillos led by independent leaders who dominated local areas and were in it for personal interests. All political leaders agreed on the government of republic, but not on the type of republic.
Centralists wanted a strong, centralized national government with broad powers. They were supported by conservatives who resisted change and didn't want society to be based on individualism.
Federalists wanted policies to be set by regional governments and not a centralized or national government. They were supported by liberals who stressed individual rights and wanted a secular society and decentralized form of government.
Liberals attempted to limit the church's role in government in order to keep it secular. Slavery was also an issue that struck the consciences of all of the political parties of Latin America.
The Monroe Doctrine was established in 1823 by the United States, stating that any European attempt to colonize the Americas would be met with force. This protection opened Latin America up to world trade, where they relied on foreign markets and imports, but eventually developed internal markets as well.
Instability became an issue in Mexico between the Centralists and Federalists, so it became targeted by foreign countries. Texas declared independence, and the U.S. voted to annex it because of its personal goals. This resulted in the Mexican-American War. The U.S. seized California and eventually captured the Mexican capital, forcing Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which gave half of Mexico's territory, California, and Texas to the United States.
La Reforma was led by Benito Juarez, a liberal, against Santa Anna, a conservative, in 1854 Mexico. This forced landowners to give up land, but the land was bought up, causing most of the rural population to remain homeless. Juarez was named president of Mexico, and then civil war erupted when the losing conservatives turned to the French and Napoleon III for help. They arrived in Mexico in 1862 and seized the capital, where Habsburg was named Emperor of Mexico. He was conservative but tried to gain the liberals and Juarez's support, but failed because Juarez didn't believe in a foreign prince ruling. French troops withdrew and Habsburg was murdered, while Juarez returned to office, and a general took over after Juarez's death that became a virtual dictator.
The Ottomans, Islamic heartlands, and Qing China all saw their decline and fall around the same time period. The first civilization, the Ottoman Empire, was weakened by the fact that they had a succession of weak rulers and lots of violence among elite groups.
The wealthy landed elite called the Ayin colluded with officials to take a portion of the tax revenue that was due to the Sultan. They also took everything they could from the peasant class when they were already impoverished.
However, there were much more serious threats by outside military forces. The Ottomans were pushed out of the northern Balkans and Hungary due to internal arguments and subpar military technology.
However, the Russian Empire became the biggest threat to the Ottomans. The Russians took out many poorly guarded cities, and it eventually led to the Ottoman Empire being driven out of the Balkans.
Despite all the warfare, the empire was able to survive into the 20th century. They barely hung on to their civilization through several internal reforms.
The Ottoman Society for Union and Progress, or Young Turks, arose as an organization that was opposed to Abdul Hamid. They sought to restore the previous 1876 constitution and had a successful coup against Abdul Hamid in 1908.
Western influence continued to grow in the Ottoman Empire during the Tanzimat reforms, especially with officers that became westernized. The Sultan Abdul Hamid retaliated against them heavily.
The Ottoman Society for Union and Progress, or Young Turks, arose as an organization that was opposed to Abdul Hamid. They sought to restore the previous 1876 constitution and had a successful coup against Abdul Hamid in 1908.
The next area in crisis was the Islamic heartlands. It started out with Napoleon of France invading Egypt in 1798 in hopes that he could eventually defeat the British power in India.
Muhammad Ali rose to become leader of Egypt following lots of chaos in Egypt. He westernized a lot of the military for Egypt by using Western tactics and firearms.
Muhammad Ali's reforms had a limited scope, leading them open to inroads from other European powers, and he died in 1848. His descendants ended up ruling Egypt after 1867, and they were known as the Khedives.
The British were taking over control of Egypt, and Egypt wanted to conquer Sudan. Muhammad Ahmed was part of the Sudanic Sufi Brotherhood and saw the British and Egyptians as infidels.
He launched an attack on the Egyptians and won several battles against them. He died, but he had a good successor in Khalifa Abdullahi. The modest state, as they came to be known, finally ended after the British General Kitchener defeated most of their army.
The final group was the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was created after a local leader named Nur Haqi, who took control of China with the help of his 8 banner armies and a declining Ming dynasty.
The new dynasty ruled for a while but started to decline in the 18th century. The bureaucracy was becoming corrupt due to cheating and favoritism in the exam system. The civil exam system was used for the last time in 1905.
Another problem was that the public works were being neglected. Flooding became a big problem, especially in northeastern China and the Shandong Peninsula. These problems were growing fast and causing the Qing to fall.
Later, a war was fought between the British and the Qing called the Opium War over the British trade of opium, and it resulted in a British win.
Afterwards, many rebellions sprung out against the Qing, with the biggest being the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiquan. They were eventually defeated in large part to good Chinese officials such as Zhang Gufang.
The Qing dynasty eventually fell in 1911 and a new era began in China. Russia and Japan were two nations that strengthened their political structure during the 18th and 19th century while trying to ignore the growing influence of Western culture worldwide.
Russia differed a lot from other European powers before their industrialization. Before the reform, they were extremely conservative to the ideas of Western influence. Alexander I sponsored the concept of the Holy Alliance.
This was an alliance formed between the most conservative monarchies in Europe, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. However, even their efforts to undermine attempts at Western culture growing in Russia failed, because there were still revolts such as the Decembrist uprising that urged for liberal values in politics.
Russia quickly got rid of any possibilities of a revolution. Political opponents could no longer promote radical views and common people could not criticize the government. Russia even helped other countries like Austria put down revolutions.
The country continued to grow in military power and occasionally participated in wars. Russia began putting more pressure on the Ottomans, and it led to the Crimean War in 1854. However, Russia ended up losing the war because of a lack in technology that could compete with the West.
Losing the Crimean War convinced Alexander II, the new Tsar, to change the conservative policies in Russia. Reform was absolutely necessary for Russia to remain a military force.
In 1861, a final decision was made to emancipate the serf and bring an end to serfdom. However, even though the serfs were free and gained a lot of land, they didn't get any new political rights at a national level.
One of the biggest things that Alexander II added to reform Russia were zemstvos. These were local political councils that had no impact on national policy, but gave middle-class professionals a bit of experience in the government.
Throughout the 1860s, new political groups emerged that wanted to abolish all forms of formal government. These people were known as anarchists, and basically became a terrorist movement that killed Alexander II in 1881, who was then trying to maintain his hold on Russia because he had feared the reforms had gotten out of hand. 1904 was the year the Russo-Japanese War began. It primarily broke out due to tension growing between Russia and Japan when Russia began moving farther into northern China. Japan's win was very unexpected, and it gave them a chance to move into Korea.
Japan's victory caused huge protests in Russia from the common people who demanded for more reform. It led to the regime making a national parliament, the Duma, and more reforms were added, such as the Stolypin reforms. All of this was done to try to settle the peasants down. Russia's revolution was one of the greatest of all time.
In the first half of the 19th century, Japan didn't have very many changes in its political structure, but by the 1850s, Japan was forced to consider reforms because of the West.
The fear of the West increased when an American Commodore, Matthew Perry, arrived on the shores of Edo Bay and demanded for Japan to open its ports to American fleets. Japan's government officials and the shogunate saw no other choice because they couldn't compete with Western navies.
In the 1860s, the samurai began to attack Western foreigners, specifically public officials. A civil war broke out between those who wanted to accept Western influence and those who refused it. A reform group eventually won, and the Meiji government was formed. With the Meiji government, political power was centralized and many reforms were put into place. The anti-foreigner ideas were shut down, and samurais were sent abroad to study Western culture and technology.
New political nobility was formed, and another parliament system, the Diet, was created. Japan was able to take some ideas from the West and also keep their own culture alive.
When industrialization became a part of Japan around the 1870s, Japan focused a lot on becoming more modern and being able to compete with Western culture. It created a loyalty to the Japanese life among citizens, and some believed they were superior compared to other Asian powers. Japan's success is unique because they used Western influence to their advantage and kept their own identity at the same time.